The story of the M26 Pershing does not begin with triumph. It begins with frustration, fear, and a growing realization that the most powerful nation on Earth had gone into the greatest war in history without a true heavy tank. By 1944, American armored crews had spent nearly 3 years fighting in steel coffins, Sherman tanks that were fast, reliable, and easy to produce, but horrifyingly outmatched when facing the German Panthers and Tigers that roamed Europe like armored predators. Every tanker knew the terror of seeing a long 75 or 88mm barrel emerge from a tree line. Every crew had watched a Sherman 75mm shell bounce off a Panther's glacis like a thrown pebble. Every man inside a burning tank had lived the truth that Washington had refused to accept. America was fighting a tank war with a machine designed for infantry support, not for tank duels. The Sherman was a good tank, but the war had evolved, and the Sherman had not. And while American officers filed urgent reports from North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy begging for a tank that could stand toe-to-toe with German armor, those pleas struck a wall of doctrine and bureaucracy. The Ordnance Department insisted that U.S. tanks should support infantry, not engage other tanks. Tank destroyers were supposed to handle that role. It was a beautiful theory, on paper. On the battlefield, theory meant nothing. What mattered was the brutal reality that when a Tiger or Panther appeared, the Sherman was the one facing it. And too often, the Sherman died before it could even fire its second shot. American tankers understood this truth long before the generals did. They talked about the Panthers with a sour mix of respect and resentment. "It's like they built it to kill us," one gunner in Italy muttered. They joked bitterly about the Sherman's gasoline engine, lights up first time every time, a grim reference to how quickly the tank burned when hit. They traded stories of ambushes where a single Panther held up an entire battalion. They memorized the weak spots on Tigers, even though none of them expected to live long enough to use that knowledge. Each new firefight carved the same lesson deeper into the minds of American crews. We need a bigger gun, stronger armor, and a tank that fights like theirs, not like ours. But back in the United States, in offices far from the mud and smoke of Europe, the gears of change turned slowly. Engineers had already begun experimenting with heavier tank designs, T-20, T-22, T-23, T-25, and finally T-26, but development staggered under arguments about weight, engines, transport limitations, and doctrine. The U.S. Army believed mobility and numbers would always beat firepower and armor. After all, it worked against older German tanks in 1942 and 1943. Why change a system that was good enough? Tankers in the field had an answer. Because Panther and Tiger weren't 1942 tanks. They were something new, machines that punished outdated doctrine with terrifying efficiency. But in the slow grind of bureaucracy, the voice of the battlefield often arrived too late. Meetings were held, reports were rewritten, requirements were debated. The war moved forward without waiting. And as American factories poured out tens of thousands of Shermans, the Panther rolled on to the eastern and western fronts like a harbinger of a new era. Its sloped armor, high-velocity 75mm cannon, and long-range optics made it a nightmare in every engagement. The Tiger, larger and slower but almost mythically durable, added another layer of dread. Sherman crews learned to identify Tigers not by sight, but by sound, the deep growling rumble of the Maybach engine that seemed to vibrate the earth itself. The first time a Tiger knocked out 5 Shermans in a row near Anzio, American officers realized they weren't just losing tanks. They were losing time, momentum, and morale. And yet still, the Pershing did not arrive. It wasn't because Americans couldn't build a heavy tank. It was because they hadn't committed to building one. Not yet. The T-26 prototype existed, tested, waiting, but delayed by endless revisions. It had a real gun, a 90mm cannon that could shatter a Panther at respectable range. It had armor thick enough to withstand German fire. It had a silhouette that promised a new chapter in American armor history. But decisions came slowly, fatally slowly. The war burned on while America debated. Tankers kept dying while committees discussed horsepower ratios. It was a crisis of doctrine wrapped in a crisis of timing. The M26 Pershing was ready long before the Army was ready to accept it. And because of that, it became a symbol of every lesson the United States learned the hard way, late, painfully, and at the cost of lives. By mid-1944, as American forces fought through hedgerows in towns across France, the calls for a heavier tank became deafening. Commanders at the front practically begged for the T-26. Reports from Normandy repeated the same message. Shermans could win battles, but at a terrible price. The enemy was evolving faster than the doctrine. Soldiers wondered if Washington had forgotten that wars aren't won by theories. They're won by steel, blood, and the ability to adapt before your enemy does. In this atmosphere of fear, anger, and desperate hope, the Pershing became more than a tank. It became a promise, a whisper that maybe finally America was ready to fight German armor on equal terms. But the truth was harsh. The Pershing was coming, but far too slowly. Too many committees, too many revisions, too many fears of repeating the disastrous T-28 Super Heavy tank project. The men who needed the Pershing most were the ones who could not wait. And as 1944 gave way to 1945, with the Reich collapsing and the war nearing its end, the M26 Pershing was on the brink of deployment, powerful, overdue, and carrying the weight of every American tanker who had ever stared down a Panther and thought, if only we had something better. The tank that could have saved hundreds of lives was finally ready, but the war was almost over, and in that cruel timing lay the beginning of its legend. The birth of the M26 Pershing was not a moment, it was a struggle. A long and bitter campaign fought not on battlefields, but in warehouses, test grounds, drafting rooms, and conference tables, where engineers and officers clashed over the very soul of American armored doctrine. The Pershing did not emerge from confidence, it emerged from doubt. Doubt that the Sherman could continue carrying the weight of a war it was never designed for, and doubt that American tank theory, forged in the interwar years, could survive contact with the brutal reality of German engineering. In many ways, the Pershing was America arguing with itself. The story began with the T-20 series in 1942, long before the world had heard of the Panther. The T-20 was intended to be the Sherman's successor, a sleeker design with heavier firepower and new technology. But from the moment the first prototypes rolled across test courses, the Army found reasons to delay. Hydromatic transmissions slipped, electrical systems failed. The fear of producing a flawed successor weighed heavily on a military machine that had grown comfortable with the Sherman's reliability. And so, instead of accelerating development, the Army hesitated. They improved some parts, redesigned others, and added months to the timeline. Meanwhile, American tankers were already dying in North Africa, and Germany was already preparing machines far beyond what the T-20 engineers imagined. The next step, the T-23, was a radical leap, an electric transmission, smooth and futuristic. It handled beautifully in testing, but electrical reliability terrified commanders. They worried about field repairs, they worried about production, and once again, theory trumped necessity. The T-23 was approved for limited production, but never shipped overseas. A working next-generation tank sat in storage while the Sherman continued fighting battles it was outgunned in. A private in the 3rd Armored Division once said bitterly, "We don't need perfect, we need something that doesn't get us killed." But perfection, or the illusion of it, continued delaying progress. Then came the T-25 and T-26, designs that finally embraced the reality that American tankers had known since the first Tiger appeared. The next American tank needed more armor and a bigger gun. The T-25 mounted a 75mm high-velocity cannon similar to the Panther's. The T-26 went further, equipping a 90mm gun that could punch through German armor at ranges where the Sherman's rounds simply evaporated.
On the test range, the 90mm gun tore gaping holes through steel plates designed to simulate German frontal armor. Observers watched the shells punch through and whispered to each other, stunned, "That'll kill a tiger." The T-26's turret was redesigned to fit the massive breech of the 90mm. Armor was thickened. The silhouette grew imposing. The tank was no longer a polite infantry support machine. It was a brawler, a challenger, something meant not to avoid German armor, but to confront it head-on. Test drivers said the T-26 felt solid, like a tank that wouldn't crumble under the first enemy hit. Engineers stood around the hull, touching the armor as if feeling the future. This was what the soldiers needed. This was what the war demanded. But even then, politics intervened. American doctrine still clung to the idea that tank destroyers, not tanks, should handle enemy armor. Building a heavy tank capable of fighting tigers directly challenged that doctrine. Generals questioned whether they needed a heavy tank at all, insisting the Sherman's mobility and overwhelming numbers were enough. They pointed to statistics showing the Sherman won most engagements, without acknowledging those victories often came at horrific cost. Reports from Normandy, Italy, and France told the truth brutally. Sherman units could win, but only by paying in blood. Platoons lost half their tanks in a single encounter with a Panther ambush. Veterans began calling Panthers the Sherman collectors, and still the T-26 waited for approval. Each week lost was another battlefield where American crews faced armor that outclassed them. When the first batch of 20 Pershings arrived in Europe in February 1945, they were greeted not with ceremony, but with exhaustion. Tankers who had survived 2 years of fighting felt something close to grief. "If we had this a year ago, half my friends would still be alive," one veteran muttered. It was a heavy burden for a new machine to carry, the weight of what might have been. But the truth was undeniable. Despite delays and resistance, the M26 Pershing represented a breakthrough in American tank design. It brought together every lesson written in blood from Tunisia to the Ardennes. Sloped armor, a powerful gun, better suspension, a turret that built to fight, not to observe. The Pershing embodied the transformation of U.S. armor doctrine from quantity first to quality driven. It didn't matter that it arrived too late to change World War II. What mattered, what history would remember, was that it arrived just in time to change everything after. The Pershing was not the tank that won the war. It was the tank that forced America to rethink how wars should be fought. It was the tank that paved the way for the Patton series, the M60, and ultimately the M1 Abrams. The Pershing wasn't built for 1944. It was built for 1945, and for every year that followed.
They arrived quietly, almost anonymously, 20 dark, hulking shapes rolling down the ramps of cargo ships into the cold February air of Antwerp. No trumpets, no speeches, no lines of cheering crews welcoming a new age of American armor. Just 20 tanks, each one weighed down by 3 years of battles it had never fought and thousands of lives it had never been there to save. The M26 Pershing had finally reached Europe, and the war was already slipping away. To the men who had survived North Africa, Italy, Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest, and the Ardennes, the Pershing looked like a creature from another world. Its turret sat wide and menacing. Its 90mm gun seemed impossibly long compared to the squat 75s they'd lived and died beside. Its armor, thick, sloped, unapologetically heavy, gave off an impression no Sherman had ever managed. This tank is here to fight German armor, not run from it. But the bitterness was unavoidable. Some crews walked around the new tanks in silence, touching the glacis plate as though feeling the weight of lost time. Others cursed under their breath.
One sergeant, who had fought Panthers in Normandy with a Sherman whose rounds hit and bounced like hail on a church roof, stared at the Pershing's 90 mm and whispered, "Too late, boys, too damn late." But late or not, Europe was about to see what America could build when it finally committed to matching German firepower. The 20 Pershings were assigned to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions first, divisions that had bled terribly in 1944. They did not treat the new machines gently. Their commanders, eager to see if the M26 truly lived up to its promise, pushed them forward at the earliest opportunity. And so, in the ruins of Germany's western frontier, the Pershing fought its first battles. The most famous moment came in Cologne, March 6, 1945. The city was already half destroyed, smoke rising from shattered buildings, rubble choking the streets. Hidden among those ruins, perched like a wounded predator making its last stand, was a panther. American patrols spotted it covering the cathedral square, its 75mm long barrel pointed toward advancing infantry. No Sherman could safely challenge it head-on. Everyone knew that. Everyone had learned that lesson the hard way. But this time, the Americans had something different. A Pershing from the 3rd Armored Division, T-26E3, number 26, was ordered to engage. The crew moved through the streets cautiously, the commander scanning through broken windows and collapsed walls. War correspondents watched from nearby rooftops with a camera rolling, unaware that they were about to capture one of the most iconic tank duels in history. The Panther saw the Pershing first. It fired. The shell smashed into a building beside the American tank, blasting concrete dust into the street. The Pershing kept coming. The gunner tracked the Panther, breathing steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Gunner, Panzer 11 o'clock. I see him. Fire." The 90mm roared like a thunderclap trapped in a stone corridor. The shell slammed into the Panther's front plate, ripping through steel that Sherman's had never penetrated. Flames burst from the German tank's hatch. The camera caught it all. The Panther burning, the Pershing holding its aim steady, the smoke curling into the sky above Cologne Cathedral. For the men who saw the footage later, it felt like witnessing a myth shatter in real time. The Panther, the terror of Normandy, the killer of Sherman's, had been killed in seconds by an American tank. And not by swarming it, not by flanking it, not by sacrificing 3 tanks to land a lucky hit, but by defeating it in a clean, undeniable duel. It was a message broadcast to every American tanker. You finally have a fair fight. The other Pershing saw action across the Rhine and into the Ruhr pocket. In Remagen, Pershings provided heavy support as American forces seized the Ludendorff Bridge, one of the most decisive moments of the final campaign. Pershings knocked out entrenched German positions and dueled self-propelled guns that would have shredded Sherman's before they closed the distance. In scattered engagements, Pershings fought Tiger Is with results that shocked even the crews. A Tiger that had once shrugged off American shells was now torn open at 800 or even 1,000 yards. Panther side armor, once nearly immune to 75mm fire, crumpled under 90mm impacts. Jagdpanzer crews who relied on frontal invulnerability found themselves facing a gun that could crack their casements like eggshells. But for all its power, the Pershing's real tragedy remained its timing. By the time it arrived, the German armored force was exhausted, low on fuel, low on ammunition, low on replacements, fighting with veteran crews but crumbling industry. The Pershing, had it arrived in 1943 or even early 1944, might have rewritten entire chapters of the war. In 1945, it wrote only footnotes, brilliant, decisive, but too few and too late to alter the arc of Germany's defeat. Yet the men who fought in Pershings felt something more than bitterness. They felt vindication. They felt a new sense of pride. They felt the unmistakable truth that America could build a tank equal to anything Germany created. That the Sherman had been a compromise, but the Pershing was a promise kept late, but kept nonetheless. When the war in Europe ended, the 20 Pershings were scattered across ruined towns, river crossings, and captured German roads. Some were already battle-scarred. Some still smelled of fresh paint. None of them had fired as many shots as their crews wished they could have. But every one of them had proven something that mattered not just for 1945, but for the next 50 years. America didn't just win wars with numbers. It could win with engineering, with power, and with vision. The Pershing had come too late to save the past, but it had arrived just in time to shape the future.
When the guns fell silent in Europe and the smoke drifted away from the ruined cities, most tanks of World War II began their slow journey into obsolescence. The Tiger became a museum piece. The Panther was studied, then scrapped. Even the Sherman, heroic and iconic as it was, had reached the limits of what its narrow hull and small turret ring could support. But the Pershing, the tank that had barely tasted battle, the machine that arrived on the continent when the war was already collapsing under Germany's defeat, was just beginning its life. The war may have ended too soon for the Pershing to prove its worth on the fields of Europe, but the years that followed would show that the M26 was not the late arrival of American armor. It was the foundation of everything that came next. When the armies of the world lined up after 1945 to study the wreckage of the conflict, they weren't looking at the Shermans or the aging light tanks that had served since North Africa. They were looking at the future. And the future was written into the steel bones of the Pershing. The first thing military planners recognized was that the era of lightly armed, lightly armored medium tanks was over. The appearance of the Panther and Tiger had made that undeniable. World War II had been a graveyard for outdated doctrines. Tanks were no longer support weapons. They were the decisive land predators of mechanized warfare. If a nation wanted to dominate future battlefields, it would need a tank that could fight and win armored duels, withstand heavy fire, and deliver killing blows at long range. The Pershing embodied that new philosophy. Its 90mm gun, its thick glacis armor, its wide turret ring built for upgrades, everything about it pointed toward a new category of machines. Not light tanks, not medium tanks, not heavy tanks. Something else. Something that would, in time, become known as the main battle tank. But as revolutionary as its design was, the Pershing still had flaws. Flaws revealed not by the Germans, but by the unforgiving terrain of a different war entirely. In 1950, when North Korea's T-34-85s poured across the 38th parallel, the Sherman once again struggled. Its 76mm gun had trouble defeating the sloped Soviet armor, except at close range. The M24 Chaffee, fast but lightly armed, was nearly useless. Panic spread through U.S. forces as T-34s smashed through thin American lines. History seemed to repeat itself. Another war, another adversary fielding a tank that outclassed America's frontline machines. This time, however, something was different. This time, the Pershing was already waiting. M26s were rushed from depots in Japan and the United States into Korea as fast as ships could carry them. On the barren hills and rice paddies of the peninsula, the Pershing finally fought the tank duels it had been built for, and it was devastating. Its 90mm cannon tore through T-34s with ease. Its armor shrugged off shots at ranges where the Shermans were dying. In firefights around Pusan, Incheon, and the Chongchon River, the Pershing proved decisively that America had finally built a tank equal or superior to its global rivals.
Tank crews in Korea quickly learned a truth the men of 1944 could only dream about. When the enemy's tank appeared, they no longer had to fear it. They could go toward it. But the Pershing's impact was not limited to combat performance. It became the blueprint, the DNA, from which every American tank for the next half-century would evolve. Engineers looked at the M26 and asked, how do we fix what's weak but preserve what's strong? The result was the M46, a Pershing with a modern engine and drivetrain. The M46 became the M47, with a redesigned turret and improved fire control. The M47 evolved into the M58, the first tank that looked unmistakably modern, with its rounded turret, sleek hull, and thermal smokescreen capabilities. And then came the M60, one of the most successful tank families in the world, serving into the 1990s. Every one of those tanks, Patton, and finally the M60, carried Pershing's lineage in its mechanical heart. Without the Pershing, there is no M46. Without the M46, no M47. Without those, the M58 and M60 do not exist. And without that evolutionary chain, the United States would never have built the M1 Abrams, the crown jewel of American armor, the tank that still dominates the world's battlefields today. The Pershing also changed American strategy. No longer would the U.S. rely on the doctrine that tank destroyers fight tanks. The Pershing proved that tanks must be able to defeat tanks, period. No workarounds, no theoretical divisions of labor. The next war, the next generation, everything demanded a single universal fighting machine capable of crushing enemy armor, supporting infantry, surviving artillery, and dominating open terrain. The Sherman was a product of its time. The Pershing was a product of the future. Even foreign militaries studied it. Allied nations who had fought beside Sherman crews marveled at the Pershing's power. Nations planning their post-war arsenals asked for American advice, and U.S. officers pointed not to the Sherman, but to the Pershing. In Europe, NATO's early armored doctrine borrowed heavily from ideas the Pershing embodied: wide turret rings for future upgrades, high-velocity guns, balanced armor, reliable powertrains. The Pershing's shadow stretched across continents. And yet the strangest part of its legacy was its humility. It did not earn fame the way Tiger or Sherman did. It did not fight in every major battle. It did not carry a reputation shaped by thousands of engagements. The Pershing stayed quiet, unassuming, almost anonymous. But in that quiet, it accomplished something far greater than glory. It changed the direction of American armored warfare forever. When veterans visited museums decades later, many walked past the Shermans with nostalgia, past the Pattons with admiration, past the Abrams with awe. But when they paused in front of a Pershing, their voices softened. They understood what it represented. It was the promise they never received in time, the tank that could have saved lives in 1944, the machine that arrived too late for their friends, but right on time for every American tanker who came afterward. One veteran, touching the cold steel of an M26's hull, said quietly, this one is the father of them all." The Sherman won the war, but the Pershing shaped everything that came after it. It was the tank that missed its war, but defined every war that followed. The Pershing never marched in victory parades, never broke through enemy lines in great sweeping maneuvers, never became the iconic silhouette of World War II. It arrived too late for that, stepping onto the stage when the war was already collapsing under the weight of a starving German army and Allied air supremacy. But history has its own way of choosing what matters, and sometimes the machines that fire the fewest shots end up casting the longest shadows. The M26 Pershing, born from hesitation and deployed in desperation, became exactly that, a quiet giant whose true legacy lived not in what it destroyed, but in what it inspired. When commanders evaluated post-war armored performance, the Pershing stood out not for its kill count, but for its potential. It was the first American tank that proved the United States could build something powerful enough to challenge the best German armor on equal terms. It shattered the old doctrine of quantity over quality and forced military planners to accept a new truth. Modern warfare demanded a tank that could do everything: break through, exploit, defend, and engage enemy armor directly. The Pershing didn't just hint at the future, it became the blueprint for it. The evolution was immediate. The M26's biggest flaw was its underpowered engine. Its reliable but insufficient Ford GAF V8 struggled to move the tank's 46 tons with agility. Engineers replaced it with a new power plant, modernized the drivetrain, and refined the suspension. The result was the M46 Patton, the first American tank that truly built on the Pershing's foundation. With improved mobility, a redesigned hull, and upgraded fire controls, it was the first American tank that felt like it belonged in the emerging Cold War landscape. But evolution didn't stop there. The M47 Patton followed, faster, stronger, a transitional tank that brought post-war armor into the modern era. Then came the M58 Patton, a tank that many consider the first true main battle tank America ever fielded. And from the M58 emerged the tank that defined American armor for 3 decades, the M60, with its powerful 105mm gun, upgraded optics, and thick, imposing turret. All of these tanks, Patton, 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 and the venerable M60, carried Pershing's DNA. The turret shapes, the focus on gun stabilization, the balance of firepower and protection, the doctrine that tanks must be ready to fight tanks, all of it began with the M26. It was as if Pershing's silhouette stood behind every drawing board, reminding engineers, this is where we started, now make it better. But the Pershing's true legacy would not be fully realized until 1980, when the first M1 Abrams rolled out of Detroit Arsenal. Sleek, angular, armored with Chobham composite plating, powered by a gas turbine engine that screamed like a jet, and armed with a 105mm, later 120mm cannon that could kill at distances World War II tankers could barely imagine, the Abrams was everything the Sherman had never been, and everything the Pershing had tried to become. The Abrams didn't just inherit the Pershing's technological lineage, it inherited its spirit. A tank built not for the last war, but for the next one. A tank designed not around doctrine, but around battlefield necessity. A tank created because America finally understood that to defend itself and lead the free world, it needed the best, not the most. Veterans who had fought in Pershings during the Korean War visited Abrams units decades later. They touched the armor, listened to the turbine whine, and some smiled softly. "We always knew," one said, "that what started with Pershing had to end here." The line from M26 to Abrams wasn't just mechanical, it was philosophical. It was the story of a nation learning to take armored warfare seriously. In museums today, children run past Shermans because they've seen them in movies. They stop briefly at Tigers, fascinated by their size. But when they reach the Pershing, they pause, unsure why this tank, less famous, less celebrated, feels different. A docent might explain that the Pershing saw little combat, or that it arrived just as the war was ending. But if they look closely, they will notice the well-organized layout of the turret, the balanced design of the hull, the sloped armor that hinted at future doctrine, and the unmistakable presence of a machine built not for desperation, but for evolution. The Pershing stands in museums like a shadow cast across time, quiet, proud, a reminder that even a tank that comes too late can change everything that comes after. Its guns fired only a handful of decisive shots in Europe, but each one echoed forward into the Cold War, into Korea, into Vietnam, and into the deserts of Iraq, where Abrams tanks thundered through sandstorms as the undisputed kings of armored warfare.